Thank you very much, Gudrun. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be with you here today. I'm sorry that I can't speak to you in German. I tell you a quick story about my father. My father studied German. Studied German because he had to do a paper in German at the end of the 1940s in his chemistry degree. At that time, if you were studying chemistry in UK, you had to do one of your papers in German because German was still so important for chemistry. So I have a little bit of connection with German. I was very struck by the phrase that is written on our program as connected with this session. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And it made me see a connection, which you would probably see very easily, but because it was a bit new to me, meeting Renovabis in this very intense way for the first time, the connection between the phrase which is behind the name of Renovabis and this text. And I just wanted to put them up on the board for us. Together so that we can see them. So this is the phrase from the Vulgate, of course, where we can see the name of Renovabis from the Psalm. And then this is our text from Corinthians. So you can see the first one, we have an action taking place. We are asking God to send forth his Spirit, and that this Spirit will create and will renew the face of the earth. And then in the second one, we have a reference to the presence of the Spirit. So it's a more static phrase in that sense. What are things like when the Spirit is present? Well, the Spirit is freedom, or generates freedom. Of course, the Latin doesn't give us the verb, which is very nice. We can put all kinds of verbs in there that we want to. So generate, or is, or gives, or we can think. So the link we can see between these two phrases is the Spirit of the Lord. Okay, so I want to suggest that the combination of these two inspired texts that focus on the Spirit of the Lord can illuminate the way ahead for Renovabis as it celebrates its 30th anniversary and as it tries to discover how to live out its charism with which it was endowed at its genesis. You know, if we think about that name, the name Renovabis is connected with this bringing forth of the Spirit. Okay, so this charism, it was given at its genesis into the future. Now, maybe you could come up with a better way of formulating what the illumination is that we can get from the combination of these two texts for the future of Renovabis than I can. So it'd be interesting if some of you can. But for what it's worth, here is how I would put it. Okay, make ever clearer the presence of the Spirit in all our social outreach, which will lead us to freedom. So be explicit about the spiritual dimension of our work. Now, this raises a question, all kinds of questions, and I want to start with Western Europe. You know, I come from Western Europe. You can't come from much more west than I come from. My grandparents were born in Ireland, and that really is the most west. And those of us who are running Renovabis, or those of you here running Renovabis, although Germany, we could say geographically, is Central Europe, obviously in terms of its mindset, it's much closer to a country like mine. So we're the sort of Westerners here. I think we need to listen to what the Spirit in Central and Eastern Europe might be doing. And I think that's especially important for Renovabis, because Renovabis has been investing all these years in allowing this work of the Spirit to happen. So to listen to this. And I say that because I myself have benefited a lot from doing just that. The projects that I've been in, connecting me with Central and Eastern Europe, have given me a huge amount. And I want to try to share some of that experience with you today. And in doing that, we will be brought back to the challenge presented by our two biblical texts to make the presence of the Spirit felt, seen, able to be touched through the work we do on the social level, thereby promoting freedom. In other words, I think the Westerners here, we have a question for ourselves. We need to reconsider and modify our tendency to downplay the religious inspiration in what we do, which, let's say it right away, we do for a good reason, which we could formulate in different ways, but one formulation would be to emphasize everything we share with people of goodwill. You know, we heard in the last session, the German economist telling us, you know, people say, I don't have to justify my position, you know, that we share a lot with other people, that we can discuss with them and share with them. And that's really important. And our faith illuminates that, but doesn't change what it is in that sense, what's good for human beings. So that's a good reason, but it has a downside that we can increasingly see, those of us in the West. It is contributing to the loss of our institutional structures and our institutional presence in the West. You know, we're all worried about secularization insofar as we kind of carry out this kind of always bracketing off our faith. We could, to some extent, be said to be contributing to this process, you know, in some way. So I think if we listen to our brothers and sisters from Central and Eastern Europe, they can give us some help with this. And then I am pretty sure that if we let them teach us, Westerners, they will also be more likely to listen to and learn from us too. And those two lungs of Europe that Father Thomas was talking about yesterday, that Pope John Paul II used, will be able to breathe together better. And of course, that brings us back to the Spirit, breathing in the Spirit and renewing Europe as a whole more effectively. So to do what I want to do, I want to use two personal experiences and talk about them in the time available to me. Firstly, two different ways of characterizing dialogue that I've come across as part of my work at the Angelicum. One comes from Western Europe, one comes from Central Eastern Europe. The first one comes from a Belgian Dominican friar called Dominique Pier, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1958, and whose work for peace was formed around the idea of fraternal dialogue. So he's a really important reference point for us for the idea of dialogue, okay? And then the other approach comes from John Paul II, not directly, but as formulated or presented by the former rector of the Angelicum, who is a Polish friar, Michał Paluch, in a talk he gave in 2020 under the interesting title, John Paul II's Proposal for Europe, a celebration of the past, or a prophetic invitation for the future. So first, let's look at the text from Pier. Yes, there's his lovely smiling face. He was a lovely man, Dominique Pier. Okay, so we'll read together his text, which comes from his main book, Building Peace. To dialogue means to look beyond the boundaries of one's conviction, and for the duration of the dialogue, to share the heart and spirit of the other without abandoning any part of oneself, in order to understand, judge, and appreciate the real goodness and usefulness present in the thoughts, feelings, and actions of the other. One must really fill oneself with the other. It therefore requires one to put oneself, who we are and what we think, between a sort of parenthesis to appreciate the other positively without necessarily sharing the other's point of view. In this, there is a profound self-sacrifice. Now, I think when we read a text like that, we all feel moved. We all feel in some way attracted by this text. It's a beautiful text. And you can see how it comes out of the Christian tradition too. Now let's look at the next one. Okay, you can see John Paul and then a picture of Father Michał, little one, below him. So this is how Michał Paluk has formulated John Paul's idea of dialogue in relation to his proposal for Europe. So he says, John Paul II's proposal for Europe was the invitation to rediscover its strong Christian identity. But the way in which the Polish Pope tried to put this proposal into practice showed that it will be a rediscovery of the truly Christian identity. I'll say that again, a rediscovery of the truly Christian identity only if it is combined with respect for the other, interest in dialogue, and capacity for self-questioning. 3 important things. Recognizing one's own failures, weaknesses, and injustices. And he carries on. Such an attitude allowed John Paul II to make a warm place for the other inside of his own religious tradition. It seems of great importance to me, he says, that this warm place, respectful and full of interest for the other inside of the Christian tradition, should be made not in spite of a strong Christian identity, but only because of it. Now, I think that's also really beautiful vision, really attractive vision, also really rooted in the Christian tradition. Somewhat different times between these two statements, but still obviously connected, but also obviously different. Now, I want to put them both up together and say something to you while they're there. So Pia emphasizes self-emptying. Not that we should abandon our beliefs, not at all, but we should put them in brackets, put them on one side in order to focus on the other and to search for his or her goodness. Now, although that's really attractive, we can see how in a situation like the one the church faces in the West, where, especially on the public level, we are always dealing with those whose beliefs are different from our own, we end up bracketing off our faith almost all the time, practically permanently. And that's a bit complicated for us. Now, Paluk puts dialogue in another frame. Maybe we could say a bigger picture, emphasizing self-questioning and recognition of the injustices we have committed in the past. You know, we could think about the pedophilia crisis when we think about that kind of thing, which will then lead us to creating a warm place for the other within our own tradition, offering all the warmth and the richness of our Christian heritage to the other, even as we embrace in that warm place what he or she has to give us as well. Now, I think we can see how these two approaches can lead to different consequences for the future of Christian faith in the public sphere. Perhaps we could say that Pia's approach works especially well, perhaps primarily, on the level of each of us as individuals, while John Paul's, as formulated at least by Michał Paluk, works primarily on the institutional level. But in our discussion, we could probably explore further the relative benefits, strengths and weaknesses, and when they could be applied, these two approaches. So that's my first example. Okay. So now I want to move to a second example. And this comes from a doctorate proposal I received from a young Slovakian man, Samuel Trizuliak, who won a prize, the 2021 edition of a competition that our Faculty of Social Sciences runs every year to promote Catholic social teaching in the Central Eastern European region. And his winning essay is published in this book, which also has other important essays written by young people from the region, entitled Human Flourishing, Reflections from the Catholic Tradition in Central Europe. I've also got some other books here, things that we've done in our various projects to do with Central and Eastern Europe. Now, in his doctoral proposal, not the text published here, the proposal he made to us for his doctorate, which unfortunately he wasn't able to carry forward, but that's not important here. So in his doctorate proposal, he starts by considering how Western Europe considers democracy in Central Europe, and perhaps a lot of Central Europeans agree with them, to be in crisis. And he gives some examples of this. The rolling back of the abortion laws, its resistance, democracy in Central Europe, to LGBT rights, and the introduction of legal provisions that define marriage as being between a man and a woman. So things like this are seen as real steps back in the West. Now, using a more sophisticated argument than I can discuss here, he suggests that Central Europe is partly the way it is because of the impact of the moral teaching of John Paul II in the region, the impact it's had, which he summarizes using the term a culture of life. That's his sort of shorthand for talking about John Paul II's moral teaching. So then Samuel continues by saying Pope Francis confirms and echoes this teaching, quoting from Laudato Si and its references to human ecology and integral ecology. Now, later in the proposal, however, Samuel starts to talk about some of the consequences of this for Western Europe. And that's where I think it gets interesting for us here. And so I'm going to start quoting from it from that point, and I'll give you some of the text in a moment on another slide. He starts, if, as I said in my essay for the 2021 prize, the essay published here, the West is no longer the place of confrontation between substantive collective visions of social unity. It is instead characterized by a skepticism regarding the very possibility of substantive notions of right and wrong. So that's his first if the West is like this, and then his second if, and if Central Europe is a place where Catholicism resisted secularization to a relatively greater degree, we know it's not too much difference, but to a relatively greater degree than elsewhere in the West. And then the third if, and if part of this rests in it being a place where a culture of life took root, how can this unique characteristic of Central European Catholicism be used in the service of the Church in the West? And this is where I'm going to move the slide onto his text. So he carries on to sketch out the possible important argument here very, very briefly. And then this is where it starts, a quote. I think that the culture of life, this is his shorthand for the moral teaching of John Paul II. I think that the culture of life in Central European Catholicism represents an important capital for the Church in the West. Because it's in inverted commas, he's using an economic language there, something we can use, capital. It appears to me, however, that this capital can be best advanced if Central European Catholicism takes Francis's call for building a culture of encounter seriously. It seems to me that building a culture of life today is a project which can be accomplished only in the context of the larger project of building a culture of encounter. Arguably, one way to interpret the contemporary crisis of liberal democracy in Central Europe from a Catholic perspective is to say that too much focus is being put on building a culture of life and too little on building a culture of encounter. So we can see here, on the one hand, the idea that we can find things in Central Europe which provide capital or resources on which the West can draw, but also that Central Europe needs to develop a more robust culture of encounter for which we might say the West has resources to offer the East. And we might also connect this point to our previous one. Perhaps there is a more Western culture of encounter, more along the lines of Dominic Peer, and a more Central European dialogue, model of encounter, more along the lines of that proposed by John Paul II. So these are my two examples. There are many other examples I could use to talk to you on this point, but I hope you can see from both of them that we see a more explicit reference to the spiritual dimension of two key questions that we face today in the examples that come from Central and Eastern Europe on how to dialogue, really crucial problem for us today, and on the questions of democracy in a secularizing world. Now, if we had more time, I would show you that Dominic Peer and other important thinkers from Western Europe also speak more explicitly about the spiritual dimension of their work in their writings, but that later generations, my generations, our generations, have tended to drop those references. We don't remember that so much of what they did. So to some extent, we could say Central Europe can help us remember something about our own tradition too. So, getting towards the end, we may have different ideas in the two halves of Europe, but our societies are facing and will face similar church and social challenges into the future. If we are to confront these, the diversity and difference between us becomes a strength, not a weakness. And I think the examples we have looked at today providing us with a wider set of different resources. They show this, that we are provided with a set of different resources, increasing the likelihood that we will find innovative and effective ways of confronting our problems. And I think this shared learning from each other will also help us to make ever clearer the presence of the Spirit in our work, opening up new and unexpected possibilities for freedom. So if Renovabis can play a crucial role in making this happen over the next 30 years, I think it will have found a profound and life-giving way of living its charism into the future. Thank you very much.